Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton, with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of January 16th, 2025. We are coming to you this week from the War is Hell division here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest today is author and historian Bennett Parten, who joins me today to talk about his new book on Sherman's March to the Sea. Ben Parten is an assistant professor of history at Georgia Southern University, and he serves as the book review editor of the Georgia Historical Quarterly. He holds a BA in history from the University of Georgia, an MA in history from Clemson University, where he worked with renowned Southern historian Vernon Burton, and a PhD in history from Yale University, where he worked with Pulitzer Prize winner David Blight. In addition to his scholarly publications that have appeared in the journals Civil War History, Slavery and Abolition, and the Georgia Historical Quarterly, among others, Ben has also published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Washington Post, Time Magazine Digital, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Civil War Monitor, and many, many others. His new book that he is here to talk about with me today is entitled Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation, which will be published by Simon Schuster on January 21st, 2025. My conversation with Ben Parten begins now. Ben Parten, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks, Stan. Thanks for having
me. Your book will be out on January 21st. Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March, and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. My first question, how did you get interested in such a contentious topic as Sherman's March, being that you are from Georgia?
That's right. You know, it's funny. I am from Georgia. I grew up outside of Athens, and now live in Savannah. When I drive home, I essentially drive Sherman's March through Georgia. You know, it's kind of funny how that worked, and made the same drive growing up whenever my family would come down here to Hilton Head or, Fripp Island or wherever on vacation, at least once a year. But I never really, I think, imagined I would be writing about Sherman's March. I always knew I was interested in history, the Civil War, Georgia history when I was going on to grad school. But really the story about where this book begins with me reading a work of fiction. Stan, you may be familiar with E.L. Doctorow and his great fiction work on the March called Simply the March. Huge Doctorow fan. I think Ragtime is one of the great books ever written. But in Doctorow's The March, he writes, as was his style, in a way that features a real kaleidoscopic cast of characters. And one of his characters in that story is a freedwoman named Wilma Jones, who drops everything, follows Sherman's army through Georgia, arrives in Savannah. You later learn that she is the mother of another character in one of Doctorow's stories, but we won't go that far and spoil anything for anyone. But the way Doctorow wrote about her story, the way he describes Savannah as a city that is experiencing this just mass influx of people, really made an impression on me. And I immediately began thinking, as a young history student, how can we tell the story of the many other Wilma Joneses who might have been out there? I assumed she was a composite character. And so immediately my mind began working of how can we tell her story as a work of history, not just historical fiction. And in some ways, I always imagined my goal in writing this book, it was writing a kind of nonfiction handbook to Doctorow's fictional work in the March. And so that's really where this book began. It began by reading and trying to place Doctorow's work of fiction in a larger historical context and trying to answer some of these questions.
So those people who will come to this book thinking that they're going to read a history of Sherman's March, they are, but this is really a different kind of history about the March. This is not a military history. Would you call it that? Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I mean, certainly the military or the Army plays a central role in this story. I mean, it's hard for them not to. And I assume, I guess you could say I'm doing a certain kind of military history here, and this is clearly a military event. But one of the operating assumptions I've had since beginning this project was the assumption that our kind of ability to be romanced by the horrors or specter of war and the ability for us to be pulled into the kind of tried and true military of Sherman's March has kept us from seeing what it also was, which is, as I argue in the book, the largest emancipation event in American history, and for enslaved people, a real march of liberation and a freedom movement. And so my goal all along has been to kind of flip the script and view the march from a radically different perspective and really try to change um, kind of what our central operating focus of what the march is in writing this book, and do that by viewing it from the perspective of enslaved people.
And jumping right in here, I think it's fair to say that this became one of the, if not the largest emancipation event in U.S. history, as you say. But certainly, if William T. Sherman had had his way, that would not have been the case. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's 100% true. And if I can just back up and maybe flesh this out a little bit further, one of the reasons I make that claim is because when Sherman arrives in Savannah, he speculates that there are as many as 20,000 freed refugees following the army in his wake when he arrives in Savannah. That's a huge number. That's about the size of Savannah itself. And that doesn't take into account the hundreds, if not thousands, of people who might have run to the army, but then decided not to follow the army, the people who might have run to the army, followed the army, but then turned back. It doesn't take into account either the people who experienced freedom simply as a consequence of Sherman's army's movement, right? So that's in part why I make the conclusion this likely was the largest emancipation event in American history, and a kind of military campaign that did, in effect, what the Emancipation Proclamation could only ever do on paper, right? So that's one of the reasons I make that claim. But you're right to say that Sherman himself, if he had his way, that would not have been the case. I mean, by the time Sherman gets to Savannah, he has evolved some, where he once did not see slavery as having a central part in this war. He is now able to admit that targeting slavery as a way to win the war is in the U.S. Army's advantage. He also knows that styling himself as a liberator is good for him politically. But personally, on a political level, he's someone who never viewed emancipation as being all that important. And in fact, he's someone who resisted the war's evolution at every step of the way. And when he begins the march, he issues an order to his men that suggests that enslaved people who come to the army may be brought along, but only if they are able-bodied and can be of service to the army or be able to take care of themselves. But that an officer's first responsibility is to his own men and to the speed of the army itself, right? And this order I've always found to be somewhat perplexing, in part because it doesn't really say anything, right? There's no clear directive there. It's fairly ambiguous. It also, in some ways, reflects Sherman's own views about emancipation. I mean, there is an insinuation there that people who can come along have to be people who can work. Sherman always viewed refuge within his lines for enslaved people as being conditioned on their ability to provide the army with labor. But I think the most notable thing about it is that it assumes that the army will have the final say so in what emancipation looks like in Georgia. And one of the realities of the march is that is simply not the case. That enslaved people flee to the army no matter what Sherman orders. And pretty soon it becomes a reality for the army that they are not the only arbiters for what the march is going to look like, that enslaved people are going to have a say so in this campaign as well. And that is a hard reality, I think, for Sherman to wrap his mind around by the time he gets to Savannah.
So let's back up a minute. From the earliest days of this war, wherever the U.S. Army appeared, enslaved people sort of intuitively understood that they represented freedom, that the Army represented freedom. And from the earliest days, I think enslaved people tried to get to U.S. lines and sort of take us through that evolution, because you do that in the book. You talk about how from the earliest days of the war, the Army, even before it was an official U.S. policy, of course, but the Army took in people and classified them
Yeah.
as different things. Walk us through that, if you will.
Yeah, so that's true. I mean, one of the key features of the war from the beginning all the way to the end is that enslaved people, as you said, intuitively knew that the army, as a representation of the U.S. government, was a kind of instantiation of, if not freedom, then refuge of some kind, but most often freedom itself. Um, But this is hard for the government to deal with, especially early in the war when it has not begun to make this evolution to embrace emancipation. And so what we see early in the war is a kind of stopping and starting movement, a kind of halting movement in bits and pieces on the part of the U.S. government to slowly embrace a more full-throated or more sort of robust policy of emancipation. And it begins early in the war in 1861 in an attempt to define enslaved people as contraband, which doesn't recognize the humanity of enslaved people, but nonetheless recognizes that they are items that can be requisitioned, and therefore they do not have to return them to Confederates who want to have them remanded. Then, early 1861, Congress passes what's known as the First Confiscation Act, which authorizes the Army to not turn over enslaved people who have come into Army lines back to Confederate slaveholders who were wanting them remanded if it can be determined that those enslaved people had been put to work on Confederate defenses. In other words, if enslaved people claim they're being forced to aid and abet the Confederacy, the U.S. Army can basically keep them in their lines and not remand them to those slave owners coming to U.S. Army lines and wanting them returned. But this policy was very hard to enforce. There was real confusion over who has the final say-so. Is this a court that makes these decisions? Is it the Army themselves? To what degree do they trust enslaved people? Moreover, are you really going to ask Union soldiers, U.S. soldiers, to turn over enslaved people who come to the lines claiming freedom and wanting refuge? That's a tough pill for many within the Army to swallow. And so this original First Confiscation Act is one that is deeply flawed. You add that to the fact that as 1861 moves into 1862, the war really ramps up in places out west in Shiloh and West Tennessee and northern Mississippi, in Virginia with the Peninsula Campaign. You have instances in which more and more enslaved people just continue to flee to the Army. And so this phenomenon gets larger, places more pressure on the government. And eventually Congress revises that First Confiscation Act with the appropriately named Second Confiscation Act, which is the closest Congress will come to an outright emancipation decree. And it basically says that enslaved people who come into Army lines will be free. Lincoln, of course, as Congress is passing this in the summer of 1862, has his own Emancipation Proclamation written, but he famously keeps it in his desk drawer. He withholds releasing it until the victory at Antietam in September. But nonetheless, Lincoln himself sees his own Emancipation Proclamation as essentially a order that already has a congressional mandate in the form of the Second Confiscation Act. And in fact, I've heard, I can't verify this, but I've read that Lincoln essentially, when he issues it, he takes the text of the Second Confiscation Act and attaches it to his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So he sees it really as just a continuation of the work Congress had been doing. And so that's a little bit of an example of how this policy gradually evolves over the early stages of the war.
The traditional accounts of Sherman's march that are a little more focused on the military, blow by blow, where you're departing from those, because this is you're looking, this is Sherman's march on new ground. Sherman said that he wanted to march an army across Georgia to prove to the people of Georgia that both the Confederate government could not protect them, and also that he could cut himself off from his supply lines, take his army across, and just sort of do whatever he wanted and demonstrate that the war was basically over. What you're arguing is that he was able to do all of that, but this was not just a military maneuver, but his taking his army out of Atlanta and across Georgia, it became, if you will, a magnet for enslaved people who followed him and thereby freed themselves. That this was not necessarily an army of liberation as much as an army that had to recognize, as you put it in your book, a revolution that was already underway. And by the time, as you said, they got to Savannah, tens of thousands of African Americans were following this army. And so walk us through that interpretation in terms of really a new departure this is, but also once they got to Savannah, what did they think was then going to happen? They being the African Americans, not necessarily the army, because that's where the story really begins to get interesting.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, um, certainly enslaved people thought that the army was an army of liberation, in part because by this time the Emancipation Proclamation has suggested that that's in fact what the armies were, and that if they could get to the army, they could in fact find freedom. Now, what freedom meant when enslaved people arrived, that's one of the great questions of the Civil War, because there's been so much great work now showing that emancipation itself and the kind of freedom enslaved people found was really a kind of ongoing refugee experience. It was never defined. It was never certain, right? This is well before any sort of notion of someone's citizenship rights had ever come into the equation. And so it's a really kind of murky question as to what enslaved people would find when they got to the army. And the march itself is a great example. I mean, in some cases, the army was very willing to have many of these refugees follow them, especially early as the march is going through middle and central Georgia, where the plantations, the farms are very abundant. There's not that many rivers yet to slow the army's process. But by the time the march reaches Savannah, as this refugee movement grows, there are more rivers to cross. The plantations on the coastal plain are not as abundant. There's a question of running out of food. There is an attempt to begin turning people away. And so we can see this kind of complexity of emancipation unfold right here in Georgia as the army is moving. And two, we've got to recognize that, yes, Sherman is the general in charge, but he divides his army into two wings, both of which have two different army corps. So there's effectively four columns marching in Georgia, and there is a devolving of command on different people, many of whom have different approaches to whether or not they are willing to allow the refugees to follow their lines or not. So it can be a very confusing process. And as to the question about what enslaved people expect when they arrive in Savannah, I think it's unclear. They expect freedom of some kind, but again, it's a freedom that's going to be undefined. I think they always expect some form of refuge and some form of security. That's something that's clear to me that enslaved people expected from the very beginning, which is that the Army, as a representative body of the U.S. government, can provide them some sense of security and refuge. I also think that there is an aspect in which many enslaved people think that they will find some form of community, maybe even family, and other refugees who have made this movement as well. And so I think the great hope is for them to begin putting the kind of constitutive pieces of freedom together and to begin building some sort of new life out of slavery in this moment.
And I think it's I should say the title of your book comes from the fact that the army, in asking individuals, where is it are you going? And the answer was somewhere toward freedom, wherever that
Yeah.
was. Um, let's talk a little bit about you mentioned the wings. Tell me about Sherman's army. How many people are we talking about as they leave Atlanta? What direction do they go, and who's in charge?
Yeah, sure. So the army itself is about 60,000 troops, and they begin marching sort of east and south. One of the wings marches due east towards Decatur and then eventually Covington. This is the left wing. It's commanded by Henry Slocum, who is a New Yorker who's maybe best remembered for being a pivotal player in the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, actually. And then Sherman's right wing marches due south out of Atlanta through Jonesboro and marches on Macon before beginning to kind of angle its way back towards Savannah. And that is commanded by Oliver Otis Howard, who is a Bowdoin alum. He is someone who had fought in the East. He had been somewhat embarrassed at Gettysburg and at Chancellorsville, and he's getting a sort of second chance with Sherman's army in Georgia. And he's probably best known as the quote unquote Christian general. He's someone who was a real evangelical. He reportedly hated swearing, hated drinking, and really wore his Christian faith on his sleeve. And I should say that I sort of don't mean to make a joke about it, but the other thing to sort of note about him is that his sleeve was very prominent, in part because he lost an arm in the East. And so he always had one of his sleeves pinned up because of his amputated arm.
And so it sounds like one wing took I-75 toward Macon, and the other one went that sort of I-20 out toward
No,
Augusta.
that's it's funny you say that. That's almost exactly the route that they take. Is one wing takes I-20, one wing takes I-75, and then once the two wings get to about Milledgeville, I suppose you could say, and then Macon, they begin to sort of start angling its way down what I think of as U.S. Highway 1 territory.
Hmm. Hmm.
I can't think of S441 right through Milledgeville starts angling its way down
Hmm.
to Savannah in that direction.
So the legend of Sherman's March is that these 60,000 men are on the move and they are looking to keep the army fed. They're also there to destroy. And so the
Yeah.
legend is that they burn everything in their path, right? Every plantation home, every house, every private dwelling, everything is destroyed. And you take great pains to talk about the fact that that was not in any way, shape, or form the intention of the Army in the written instructions for what they were supposed to be doing and requisitioning food. And in fact, we know from surveys done after the war that many plantation homes and private homes were still standing well into the 20th century. What did the Army find when they got out beyond Atlanta on the march, both in terms of people and African Americans, white Southerners? What was the reception? What was it like to be on the march with Sherman?
Well, it kind of varied, but one of the sort of characteristics that became very obvious to me when I was reading some of these accounts is they found a lot of empty plantations. The fact is, a lot of plantations they came across were those that had already been evacuated, or if they hadn't been evacuated, at least the male head of the household, who had already, in most cases, pledged their loyalty to the Confederacy, would evacuate and leave, in some cases, their families behind, or maybe even they left enslaved people and an overseer behind or something like that. So in many cases, they were evacuated or semi-evacuated to, I mean, if we sort of use that phrasing, right? At least the head of the household had already left. But you're right. I mean, there has been this long-standing story of Sherman's marches, one of fire and brimstone. But Sherman was pretty clear about wanting the foraging done by the book. I mean, he was clear about his intention of trying to target the material and emotional wherewithal of Southerners to continue the fight while also trying to feed his army. But he's also clear that he didn't want dwellings burned. He only wanted cotton houses burned, cotton gins, cotton presses. He ordered that his men were never to enter into the home of a house. He ordered so that only his officers could requisition livestock on the assumption that they would be more judicious in determining whether or not they needed it. And he only ordered his men to requisition enough food to last them about 10 days, which is hardly right. Sort of a story of someone who's just indiscriminately burning and requisitioning whatever they can find. He even specified that he wanted the army to be heavy-handed in the case of rich planters and much more lenient in the case of poor white Georgians. Again, on the assumption that rich planters had more than they could afford to give, and that also were keeping up the fight, whereas poor white Georgians could ill afford to lose a horse or a cow and had already largely given up. Um, so this is in part the kind of rules of what foraging looked like. Now that said, this is still 60,000 men moving through a state at a quick pace in the middle of the Civil War. It's not to say this wasn't a massive wave of humanity. It's not to say that there weren't instances where things might have gotten out of hand. And in fact, Sherman is also really clear that if white Georgians were to fire on his soldiers or resist the foraging parties, that basically all bets were off, right? All those restrictions were off the table. And then two, one of the features of Sherman's march was that there were always a group of people that were sometimes referred to as bummers, sometimes stragglers, who were basically the foragers who went rogue. They would branch out from the main body of the main foraging bodies, really pay little heed to Sherman's directives, and basically sort of feed themselves right on whatever they could find. And then they were usually beyond kind of any sort of reining in. So Sherman definitely wanted this done by the book, and there was some level of order, but there's only so much order that can be applied, right, to 60,000 people moving at that speed through Georgia. And the other thing they found, just to go back to the original question, is they found enslaved people who were willing to help them. the soldiers were always fascinated by the fact and are always quite clear about the fact that enslaved people in Georgia were usually, almost without exception, their allies. That enslaved people would point the way to hidden paths in the woods, provided them valuable pieces of intelligence. In many cases, because it was enslaved people themselves who had hidden many of the plantation treasures or hidden horses out in the woods, they would pilot the soldiers to those hidden stores of goods or to those corrals. And two, one of the things that becomes clear as the march is going on is that in many cases, enslaved people are helping escaped Union prisoners get back to Sherman's lines. And so one of the things they found consistently was that enslaved people were not only their allies, but were a critical advantage that they had in making this march successful.
Yeah, it really sounds like that for the most part, enslaved people, African Americans in Georgia, were acted as a fifth column almost to the
Sure,
Confederacy.
sure.
You make it clear that as the army approached Savannah, things got a little bit worse because it wasn't as easy to find food and it wasn't as easy to find things to feed. And so many of the army commanders became somewhat reticent to continue to try to bring the refugees along with them. And this is where you really tell the story in some chilling detail. You tell us the story of what happened at Ebenezer Creek, and there was another incident that happened even before that. Walk us through that, if you will, because now we get into some of the details about who are some of the heroes and some of the villains, even within the United
Yeah.
States Army in this story. Tell the story of Ebenezer Creek.
Sure, sure. Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, by the time the army nears Savannah, there is a general sense amongst the officer corps that the crowd of refugees at the rear of the columns have gotten too large. There's a real question of food, in part because the plantations there are not nearly as bountiful as some of the ones they had found come across earlier. And there are more rivers and streams and swamps which slow up the army's progress. So suddenly the march has sort of changed, right? It's gotten slower, there's less food, and there's growing alarm about the refugee movement. And I haven't found smoking gun evidence that Sherman ever ordered this. I've never really found great qualitative evidence to suggest that this was a army-wide directive. But there is nonetheless a sense, or at least a common pattern amongst commanders to begin turning people away. And as you said, we're much more reticent now about the refugees. And the darkest episode in this evolution of the march is what happens at Ebenezer Creek, and it is put into place by a man named Jeff C. Davis, which is not Jeff F. Davis, the Confederate president. I want to be clear; those are two separate people, despite sharing the same first and last name. And Davis was Sherman's head of the 14th Army Corps, which was one of the four columns that marched through Georgia. And his column sloped the closest to the Savannah River, which meant that it was his column that was moving through the swampiest terrain, the terrain that was most filled with rivers and streams and creeks. And Davis is someone who was well known for being sort of army-wide villain. All the way back in 1862, he entered infamy for walking up to a fellow U.S. general, a man named William Bull Nelson, and essentially murdering him in cold blood over a matter of personal offense. Uh, Davis, though, gets off in part because they're in the middle of the war and they need experienced commanders. So he never, even goes to trial. He's never, punished for murdering Nelson. But people in the army knew it. They knew he had this reputation. Uh, and Davis was someone who was never comfortable with the fact that the refugees were always following. He puts it in writing, the fact that he cannot stand the fact that the refugees are following him. And as early as just past Milledgeville, at a place called Buckhead Creek, we know he tried to block the refugees from following his column by pulling up temporary pontoon bridges after the army crossed to try to leave the refugees on the other side, leave them stranded. There's evidence to suggest he likely did this once, maybe even twice more before reaching Ebenezer Creek. But it's at Ebenezer Creek where he does the exact same thing and where disaster strikes. Because all along that he's trying to do this, it's Army-wide knowledge that Confederate cavalry led by Joseph Wheeler is circling and swarming and looming all around. And it's Army-wide knowledge to leave the refugees on the opposite bank was to leave them um, basically for the taking, and leave them incredibly vulnerable to Confederate cavalry attack. And that's exactly what happens at Ebenezer Creek,
Who
which
who would
is
either
a
kill who would either kill them or re-enslave them?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Who would either kill them or re-enslave them. That's exactly what those in the Army knew to be true. And Ebenezer Creek, which is just north of Savannah, what would you say, Stan? Maybe like 20 miles north of Savannah,
Yeah,
something
I
like
think
that, give
that's
or
right.
take.
Hmm.
It was described by one of Sherman's commanders as a great bayou or arm of the Savannah River, which is, I think, fairly accurate. Um, and
Swollen
as
with
soon
water
as
at that time of year, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Swollen with water that time of year. And for those who've been there now, I would assume the current would have been stronger because of the way erosion and water patterns and things have developed. But as soon as the Army crosses, the bridge goes up, the bridges are pulled up. There's some sources that suggest that the Army burned them for good measure. And no sooner had the bridge gone up before Wheeler's Confederate cavalry barreled into the refugees stranded on the bank. Some of the refugees jumped in the water for safety. Others went up and down the bank, trying, according to some sources, crawl up under the riverbank to find some form of shelter. Wheeler's men fire into the crowd, fire into the water. And it's unclear how many perished or how many were captured and re-enslaved. But we do know that families were torn apart, that people died, that what happened there was a real tragedy and a real horrific sight. And it was a real turning point in the march. Many of the soldiers who saw it from the opposite bank, who were throwing planks and limbs to try to help the refugees across, were mortified at this. And the fact that the refugees would risk everything, including death, to keep following the army, was a real eye opener about how important freedom was to them. But it was also a turning point for the refugees themselves. As I said, families were torn apart in this moment. People lost loved ones, they lost friends, they lost family, and they now could not turn back if they wanted to because they knew what awaited them on the other side of the bank. So this was one of the real turning points in this march that lasted about a month and a half.
And to be clear, we say Ebenezer Creek. People in their minds think of a creek. They think, well, I was growing up. I used to play by a creek. You could wade across it,
Sure.
right? It was ankle deep at its deepest. Ebenezer Creek, particularly in December, is swollen from rains, and at that time, we're thinking something really that's more on the scale of a small river, right? And it was
Exactly.
deep. There was a current, as you say. It was very wide at that point, and we're talking hundreds of refugees who would have been on the riverbanks trying to make this decision whether to jump into the water and try to swim across, get shot down. You describe how children, some parents get to the other side of the river and realize their children are gone. They're not there. They've
Yeah.
been swept
And
away. They've been shot.
the soldiers realized it as well.
Yep.
People who they recognize as traveling with small children before Ebenezer Creek are no longer traveling with those children, and it's a
Hmm.
real sobering moment for some of these soldiers.
So let's jump fast forward a little bit because this is also part of the really fascinating part of the story after Ebenezer Creek. After Sherman finally, depending on your point of view, captures or liberates Savannah on December 22nd, some weeks later, one of the things that happens around this time of year in January, 160 years ago, in 1865, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton comes to town, and there is an important and historic meeting that happens here in Savannah as a direct result, really, of Ebenezer Creek. So,
Yeah.
can you jump forward and talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the things that I was surprised by when I was doing the research and writing this book and sort of thinking about this story. Um, Sherman meets with 20 of Savannah's African American religious leaders in early January. Um, after his army makes it into Savannah. I already knew that. I always knew this story. I always knew it happened. I'll talk about it more in just a second. But I was surprised by the fact that what happened at Ebenezer Creek is really the kind of pretext and backstory for why this meeting was called. Uh, and it's called in part because it's unclear how exactly, but word of Ebenezer Creek begins to filter back to DC and elsewhere. It gets in the newspapers. There's sort of whispered rumors of what happened, and pretty soon a narrative emerges that never comes close to the narrative of casting Sherman as a conquering hero, but nonetheless is one that portrays him as someone who has committed grave offenses to the freed people following his soldiers, or following his army, and that he could have liberated even more people in Georgia had he been willing to follow through on the government's pledge to see emancipation through. So is this narrative that's on the rise? And the fact that word of Ebenezer Creek gets out, it leads Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, to come down to Savannah on the pretext that he's there to inspect the city, to requisition some cotton that is still in Savannah. But when he's there, Sherman very quickly realized that he's also there to investigate what happened along the march and to find some sort of answers at what happened at Ebenezer Creek. At one point, he point blank pulls out a newspaper and asks Sherman to answer for the stories about Ebenezer Creek. And this leads Stanton to want to have a meeting with 20 of Savannah's Black religious leaders in the Green Mansion here in Savannah on Madison Square. And it occurred to me as I was writing this book and as I was doing some of the research, is that there is real fears here on the part of the government, of the War Department, for this being a bad PR episode, in part because the US government is trying to actively recruit Black soldiers, members of the USCT. And I think they're very fearful that if word of Ebenezer Creek gets out further, if something isn't done to hear out some of these important Black leaders, there's not something done to allay fears, there may be those who encourage folks not to enlist or encourage African American men not to enlist in the Army. And so I think that the government's very worried about losing the kind of PR battle here in the later stages of the war. This is all kind of pretext for why I think this meeting is so important for Stanton. The meeting takes place in the Green Mansion. It's really a pretty astounding meeting when you think about it. Stanton is there, Sherman is there. Stanton does all the questioning. He's a seasoned lawyer. He's well trained. He's a very clever individual. This is someone who's become Lincoln's right-hand man in Washington, D.C. And the 20 Black religious leaders, they appoint a man named Garrison Frazier as their spokesman. Frazier is someone who had purchased his own freedom and his wife's freedom some 10 years earlier. And fast forward to now, here he is holding court with two of the most powerful men in the country. And the pretext for the meeting, or at least the subject matter, is what to do about the freedmen of the state of Georgia, meaning those refugees. But very quickly, the meeting becomes this referendum on what freed people want out of freedom or expect out of freedom. And Frazier offers some of the most astounding answers you could think of. And at one point, Stan asked him, to define slavery and freedom, and he gives these incredibly concise answers. But the message Frazier gives Stanton is that the way for freed people to better take care of themselves and to freedom and to provide them with independence is to have land. This is the thing that freed people want more than anything. But what's funny enough, and well, two things I think that are also really interesting about this meeting is that Frazier also goes on to admit, because Stanton asked him, how did he form his opinions? And Frazier basically says, well, in my ministry, talking to all the refugees, whose numbers surpass even my own expectations, right? He says this. He says that he, in part, developed these opinions in just talking to the refugees themselves, which to me, I sort of took as, here are these refugees, these people who have been nameless and faceless in the historical record. who followed Sherman's army, are here by the weight of their own movements, right? Really forcing the government to recognize them and recognize their demands and their wants, which is kind of an astounding thing when you think about it, and especially when you think about what comes next. But the other thing that happens in this meeting that is also really fascinating is at one point, Stanton asked Sherman to leave the room, and he asked those religious leaders what they think of Sherman.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes very clear in this moment that this is really a kind of investigation, a inquisition, kind of mini tribunal into Sherman's conduct. And Sherman knows this. In his memoirs, years later, he never let Stanton forget this. Of course, they have other grievances that they have to get over later in the war. But Sherman's pretty clear about the fact that this is really a kind of statement on his conduct. But what the religious leaders say is that they actually see Sherman as being sent from God. They many of them actually called on him when he came into the city, and he met with them and was very kind to them, heard them out. And so they basically tell Stanton they have the utmost faith that he is a gentleman and that he will follow the laws of the land and act in their interest when possible. And so Sherman gets a real vote of confidence from the Black religious leaders in this meeting.
And you make clear that what comes out of all of this is the need at the end of the day, if freedom is going to mean anything to the formerly enslaved people, they're going to have land, right? And this is where Sherman's Field Order 15 comes out of this, that grants freedmen land confiscated from Confederates up and down the coast of Georgia and Florida and even South Carolina. And you talk about the Port Royal experiment. And I'm going to move us ahead a little bit here just in the interest of time. But really, at the end of the day, I think if I read you correctly, it's this that you say really makes Sherman's march really important in American history. Yes, it was this almost Napoleonic march of epic proportion, historical scale, but it was because it forced the United States of America to come face to face with really what it meant to be free. Is freedom just a word for working for wages for somebody else? Is it the freedom to work your own land when you've been withheld this right for so long? All of this comes out of the next few months and the next few years in Reconstruction. And ultimately, of course, President Andrew, not to give anything away, but I think we all know, President Andrew Johnson rescinds everything and gives the land back almost in totality to the white Confederates at the end of the day. And so all of these formerly enslaved people are sort of left with almost nothing except freedom and a very constricted view of what that is. I want to read this right here at the end of your book. You say the American Civil War is not just a war between two sections or a war that would end slavery, but a war that would shape the meaning of freedom for the next century or more. A war, if you will, for an American jubilee. In the end, not the burning of Atlanta, Sherman's tactics, or Sherman himself, not the grievances of the white South, and certainly not the concept of total war, is why and how we should remember the march. Like Yorktown, Gettysburg, and Selma, Sherman's march was a landmark moment in the history of American freedom. Talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, sure.
I mean,
No,
besides the fact that's brilliantly written, of course, yes, but
well, that's very nice
that's a
of you.
bold statement, Ben.
Yeah, no, it's bold. It's meant to be bold. But I think your reading of this moment and sort of what I was thinking through when I was writing this book is correct, which is that this is a moment that, yes, it's a military campaign, but it was a movement of such enormous size and consequence. And enslaved people, the refugees, made it a movement that they would have a part in, forced the U.S. government, forced America to reckon with what freedom would ultimately mean. And so I think it becomes a real crucible of freedom itself. And yes, you're right. I think what happens in Georgia is incredibly important, but it's only when the army and when the government begin trying to deal with the aftermath of this movement that really these sort of questions of what freedom would mean come to the fore. And that is ultimately, I think, the biggest sort of takeaway from this book. It's one that surprised me too. When I began working on this, I knew I had a story of what happens from Atlanta to Savannah. I wasn't really sure how this story would end, but it's only when I began sort of pulling the threads together that I began seeing how the march becomes a real set piece for what Reconstruction would look like. And everything from the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, what it would look like, to this pursuit of land and the ultimate failure of land reform here on the coast, to even, as you said, the very meaning of freedom itself, all has kind of storylines or plot points that begin, in some cases, end with the aftermath of Sherman's march. And so from the very beginning, I always had this sense that this was really a march, but it was one that really had sort of social consequences beyond just the Atlanta to Savannah and just the sort of general story of the cut and dry Savannah campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you're absolutely right. And I think, there on the quote that you read is really what I try to get at in the book, which is to imagine this moment as one of these signature moments, defining moments when we think about what American freedom actually means. And certainly for enslaved people who were running to Sherman's army, they were running and imagining freedom with every single step, right? And thinking about what freedom meant to them. And I think one of the things that I've always thought about the march, and one of the things that I hope comes through in the book, is that the momentum of the march creates this incredible opening to define freedom. And it's one in which enslaved people are actively taking part in defining what freedom might look like. And it's only because the march was such a huge phenomenon that that window and momentum is ultimately created. And so I don't think I really responded to your question very well there, but I think you're absolutely right to
Oh, you
sort of pick
absolutely
up
did. Yeah.
on some of these things.
One of the things I think that you did very well, and you made a point of saying, and I just want to point this out. A lot of people who read about and write about this period would say, well, why I don't know why these freed people expected to be given land, that they weren't going to have to work for it, because that was distinctly un-American to just be expected some socialistic experiment. You point out, and most historians have pointed this out, white people had been given land since the very beginning of the idea of the colonies, right? From the King's
Sure.
Grant all the way up through the Homestead Act of 1862, white people were given millions and millions of acres of land for free in this country, going back to its earliest days, right up until into the Civil War. Not to mention, of course, white Southerners had been benefiting from free labor for years and years and years before the Civil War. So that's a key point that you make very well in this book. There was nothing un-American about this whatsoever. To expect that you were finally going to be compensated in some way with land. This book grew out of your dissertation at Yale. How hard was it to research right as the pandemic was beginning?
Well, uh, uh, very hard. If I could just say something and just respond to the first part of that, though, Stan, is
Yeah,
that's
sure.
absolutely right. I mean, the same Congress that's passing the Second Confiscation Act, and for that matter, the First Confiscation Act, is, to my knowledge, the same Congress that passes the Homestead Act, right? Which
Yep.
makes cheaply, it's not free, but very cheap Western land available to white settlers. Technically, it's available to, if I understand the history correct, to African Americans as well. But the reality of any African American getting that land is very minimal. And then Frazier himself is clear in this meeting that he doesn't expect to be given land. They want to be placed on land that they could then therefore purchase once they are
Yep.
able to do so. So it's not
Mm.
like, it's not sort of some program and, socialistic land reform here, right? I mean, that's not quite what Frazier is advocating for, and he's very clear about that. So I appreciate you pointing this out. Um, and yeah, it was hard to write this in the middle of the pandemic. I really began writing the first chapter, though I revised the first chapter heavily, basically in April 2020, right as the pandemic was really beginning to hit, right in that moment when everyone thought that by Memorial Day, everything would be fine.
You're
And then
right.
slowly that became Labor Day, and then slowly I think the reality set in. This is going to be a longer ordeal than what we imagined, and it was incredibly difficult. But I was really able to do more than I imagined, in part because of the incredible work that librarians did to make collections digital, and to the real kindness and graciousness of folks at like Internet Archive, HathiTrust, and others to basically allow more access to some of these online materials. And I really benefited from the fact that in the post-Civil War years, particularly in the 1880s, but earlier as well, there was a real reading interest in Civil War history and in first-person accounts of soldiers' narratives. And so there were a number of soldiers' reminiscences, histories, journals, diaries, etc. They were later published in popular magazines or by book publishers that went into print. And because it was in print, I could find it available online. And so I really benefited from the sort of trends in historical writing about the Civil War and by people essentially printing their memories and their personal history. So it was really difficult from just a nuts and bolts perspective. But it was also a really isolating experience too. I mean, I did a lot of this writing in a small 600-foot apartment in New Haven, Connecticut. But I benefited too from having a lot of friends who were going through similar things, and they invited me to dissertation working groups where we met on Zoom, got to talk about things, and really kind of kept the spirit of collaborative research and writing alive, even in such a difficult environment like the COVID pandemic.
You finished your dissertation under the direction of the one and only David Blight, a mutual friend
That's
of
right.
ours and a great friend of the Georgia Historical Society. We could do a whole podcast on David Blight,
That's
so I
right.
won't ask you, but I will just say what was his biggest influence on you as you did this work?
Oh man, I can't even begin to put into words just how important David means to me, just as a person, as an individual, as a mentor. And I can't even begin to put into words, his influence on this project. I think, Stan, I talked before, and I think I told you that from the very beginning, I knew I wanted to make this a true narrative history. I wanted to write it for as big and as broad of an audience as possible. And that is not always, I think, the sort of expectation for dissertations. I think sometimes some people, in fact, that can be seen as a negative. But from the very beginning, David slapped me on the back and said, "You do what you want to do, and I will support you 100%." And he said, "I think that's a great idea." And that just meant the world to me, in part because it was licensed to do it, but it's also kind of a vote of confidence that you can do it. And I appreciate David so much because one of the things that he would sometimes ask me or question when things came up whether in meetings or when we were doing dissertation defense and others, well, it wasn't just the kind of questions of historiography or anything like that. It was questions about, well, what does the setting look like? What is it? What was it like to be on this march, to experience it? Who are the characters? Who are the people? What are their motives? And so he was asking questions that I think a really good narrative writer would ask and a really good editor of narrative writing would ask. And I don't think it's something that every dissertation advisor would always ask. But I just appreciate the heck out of David for doing it. I just, like I said, I just can't really put into words just how important he was in the making of this project and really giving me the kind of license to do it the way that I wanted to, and for supporting me and believing, that I could do it.
The book is entitled Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. It is published by Simon & Schuster. It's going to be released on January 21st, 2025. You're about to launch on a book tour. Continued great good luck, Ben, with this book and the promotion of it. And I have a feeling this will not be the last time you will be on our podcast to talk about a book that you have written.
I hope that's the case.
Oh, I won't even ask you what you're working on now, but I know that in the future you and I will be speaking again. Thanks so much for coming on, and best of luck going forward.
Yeah, Stan, I appreciate it. It's a real pleasure.
My thanks to Ben Parten for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at simonandschuster.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, the czar of our Tallahassee office, as well as the captain of the Off the Beaten Path Pooh Sticks team, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. All guest accommodations on Off the Beaten Path provided by the Horseshoe Road Inn. Our Off the Beaten Path fact checker is Ella Fino. The director of accounts payable is Bill Schroeder. Our chief accountant is Candace B. Rittenoff. Our director of purchasing is Lois Bitter. The Off the Beaten Path stock market predictor is Luigi Board. Our director of employee loyalty is Upton Leftus. Our staff layoff specialist is Harry Berderci, assisted by layoff counselor Oscar Lavista. Our door-to-door sales coordinator is Annie Von Holm. The staff physicist is Momentum. Our Russian chauffeur is Pickup and Drop-Off. Our insurance claims liaison is Royal Payne Diaz. Our customer care specialist is Begonia Payne Diaz. Our complaints coordinator is Stella Payne Diaz. The manager of the Off the Beaten Path membership refund program is Wendy Pigs Fly. Our in-house literary critic is Al Ligori. The holiday wardrobe consultant is Don Wienow. Our staff director of Three Stooges Studies is Lee Iopoka. Dr. Todd Gross's personal eBay specialist is Selma Junkoff, and our Off the Beaten Path martini mixer, thank you very much, is Olive Twist. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including now on YouTube and YouTube Music. Be sure to follow, like, and share, please. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app. That would be most appreciated. You can learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Please also visit deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out dispatches from Off the Beaten Path, my blog, and similar Total War podcasts like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.